By this point, we've covered the Age of Exploration and the conquest of the New World, the big event that spanned hundreds of years that will prove to be the cause of pretty much everything else that we study in this unit in the early modern period. Next, we're going to look at one immediate political change that occurred in Europe as a result of the Age of Exploration, and we can call it the Age of Absolutism for absolute monarchy. That's where the yellow arrow is pointing to. Note that this is a really long period of time, and it's a big generalization too. Not every single king that existed in Europe was an absolute monarch, but many were, and it was a big trend, big enough to dominate the time period. So, because this unit is full of cause and effects, I'm going to start us off with a concept map, and we'll look at it at the end too, once it makes a little bit more sense. The main thing to note is that the conquest of the New World by different European states had two pretty distinct effects that come together in kind of a roundabout way. First, green arrow for economics, material effects on Europe, so money, right? Money that came out of the New World and increased trade caused the rise of absolute monarchies. And I've color-coded like changes in power structures in pink here. It paid for them. It also paid for art and specialization that in the long run would merge with an ideological effect of the conquest of the New World, a change in how people thought and saw the world, called the Renaissance. The Renaissance, in coordination with an invention called the printing press, would then lead to big challenges to the power of absolute monarchy, which, in short, is basically everything else that we study in this unit, and includes the Protestant Reformation, which was a religious movement that held that the Catholic Church was not the only path to salvation. People can read the Bible for themselves. It also led to the scientific revolution, in which the scientific method was invented, replacing the Bible as a source of scientific knowledge for people who were interested in science, of course. And then also the Enlightenment, when social contract theory and the idea of people having natural rights replaces the divine right as a source of legitimacy for government. And then all of these big ideological changes led to political revolutions, so like concrete events where people changed their form of government, or tried to. So starting at the beginning, we're going to start with the political effect of discovering the New World, the rise of absolute monarchy in early modern Europe. In your notes today, you're going to want to focus on being able to describe absolutism and explain how discovery of the New World helped it come about, helped cause it, while also creating the conditions that in the long run would lead Europeans to develop ideas that challenge absolutism, that challenge the power of kings. And here I took the excuse to kind of give you a bunch of pictures of Louis XIV, the Sun King, and his Palace of Versailles, because there's really no better encapsulation of what absolute monarchy means than this man and his magnificent castle that still exists. You can go visit it. So starting off with a definition. What is absolutism? Absolute monarchs developed absolute or total control over their state. And their power was not checked by any laws or by any idea that like their citizens had rights. Under absolute monarchy, no decisions were made by citizens. And the king didn't have to follow any specific law because the king was the law. Further, no representative bodies or nobility or anything like that bound the king's power. So absolute total power is what kings and queens had under absolute monarchy. The system of government depended on an idea called divine right theory for legitimacy. Remember that legitimacy means the right to rule over people as perceived by the people who are being ruled over, right? It answers the question, like, who gives you the right to tell me what to do? Under divine right theory, monarchs, in theory, received their power directly from God and were accountable only to God. It's kind of like the mandate of heaven from ancient Chinese dynasties that we've learned about in the past. Divine right theory meant that the king didn't have to answer to anybody on earth. He was free to exercise his power. And Louis XIV probably had the best quote to kind of describe this idea of unbridled power. He said, "I am the state." Louis XIV believed that France belonged to him, and he was free to do with it as he wished, and he got this right from God. An idea that works basically only if most, if not all, of the population is incredibly religious, following that one same religion, Catholicism. In terms of causes, colonies in the New World supplied the conditions for both absolute monarchy to rise and also for the rebirth of European culture called the Renaissance that we'll be studying next. Colonies brought a ton of wealth to their mother countries, to their home states in Europe. And using the economic theory of mercantilism, which is kind of complicated, but involves taking wealth in the form of raw materials and minerals and stuff from the colonies, taking them back to the home state, to enrich the home state, not the colonies, also creating products with them and then selling them back to the colonies. That's where like the mother lode of this money came from. This made monarchies increasingly powerful, which led to the rise of absolute monarchy. In order to exercise this much power, kings needed a lot of money, as will become clear. There's another picture of Versailles on the slide because it's super pretty, to show you like how much money we're talking. In terms of how it worked, absolute monarchy is characterized by three main features. First, a strong central government. The king had central power, and nobody could really stand in his way. Second, and here's where the money's really important, a strong military, paid for by the king, so that they are loyal to him, not to nobles, not to anybody else, not to the country as an abstract idea, to the king himself personally. And three, the economic theory of mercantilism. So we'll simplify it because it's complicated, but basically exporting wealth from the colonies to enrich the home state. Money is power, in other words. This is new, and to really get how it's new, we can contrast with the Middle Ages, the time period before the early modern period. Kings in the Middle Ages lived under a feudal system, and feudalism prevented centralized power. It meant that like power was kind of split between the king and also the Catholic Church, but also the nobles, because the nobles controlled the armed forces, the knights, right? And that limited the king's power. The church further limited the king's power during this time, so kings were pretty weak. Finally, low trade and very little actual money in circulation meant that there wasn't a lot of tax revenue a king could collect, further diminishing their power. Right. You have pictures on the left of the slide to kind of give you an idea of the times, like cute castle, but ugh. Contrast that with what you see on the right, which is again from Versailles. I'm kind of obsessed with Versailles. A beautiful castle. You can see how much more money went into it, and that's just one room, and it's not even the biggest one. Absolute monarchy, under the early modern period, was then different because of all the money economy and trade that was happening at the time, which allowed for way more centralized power. The church wasn't as strong as it had been in the Middle Ages, and kings had money from the colonies for their own armies, so they were less dependent on nobles, so, you know, more power. It's kind of the whole idea. Plus, lots of trade going on at the time meant lots of tax money, and that tax money paid for all sorts of things, not just the army, but did I mention the beautiful palace? During this time, to the extent that it was possible given like the time period and technology, and especially relative to the Middle Ages, there were not real limits on the king's power. This was the trend for the early modern period, but as in so many other things, England decided to be the exception to the rule. England did not have an absolute monarchy because years earlier there was this terrible king named King John. He's the one from Robin Hood, you've probably heard of him, who was so awful that he was forced to sign a document called the Magna Carta, which basically enumerated rights of Englishmen. So his power and the power of the monarchy in England from that point on was limited by law and by a representative body of the upper class called Parliament. This made England a constitutional monarchy. So, not absolute, because they didn't have absolute power to do whatever they wanted. It was constitutional because a constitution, a set of laws, and this idea that the people had rights limited the power of the state. In English colonies in the Americas, however, English settlers enjoyed some, but not all, the rights that Englishmen at home would have had. And this is going to become important to the story later when we get to the American Revolution. But this is all a side note, because today is supposed to be about absolute monarchy in Europe. And at this point, I'd like you guys to pause the slide and take some notes. Be sure to note the cause, that New World colonies and more trade led to more money, and a good description. Absolute monarchs had absolute control over their country, with their power unchecked by laws or citizens. They claimed legitimacy or the right to rule from the idea of divine right. They believed, and their subjects believed, that God gave the king and his family, so his descendants, the right to rule over the country, and the king was accountable to God, not the people. Importantly, divine right meant that legitimacy for the king was tied to the Catholic Church and religious belief. So as we progress through this time period, we're going to see that religious belief kind of get chipped away more and more. And this is going to become important once we get to the Enlightenment and social contract theory and the French Revolution. Be sure to note down the three main components of absolutism: strong central government, strong military loyal to and paid by the king, and a policy of extracting wealth from the colonies. Mercantilism is complicated, like I said. You can jot down the definition. You can copy that picture that is like on the bottom right as a good, summary of that. A great example of absolute monarchy is France under Louis XIV. Did I mention Versailles really pretty? In terms of how this is different from other kinds of monarchy, and I added the note conceptual clarity here because every time you're learning a definition or a concept, it's really important not just to learn what it means, but how it's different from really closely related concepts. So we've already talked about how absolute monarchs were a lot stronger than kings in the Middle Ages. I'd also add a note about how England had a constitutional monarchy, which was different because the Constitution limited the power of the king, as did the Parliament, which was a representative body for the upper classes. Finally, let's come back to our little cause and effect slide that I worked so hard on to color code. All right, so today we learned about how money from conquest in the New World led to the rise of absolute monarchs who claimed legitimacy based on divine right. Next up, we're going to tackle the more complicated topic of ideological effects of the conquest of the New World, which involves how people think, their worldviews, mindsets. We know that the New World, the Americas, and encountering such different landscapes and people and flora and fauna generally led to more curiosity about the world for Europeans, which in turn, sincere curiosity tends to lead to more scientific questions. It also led to the realization that actually they did not have the world all figured out, which in turn caused some skepticism, a little doubt about what they had been told and the power structures that had been telling them things about the world that, as though they were certain when they were obviously not. This, in the long run, is bad for the Catholic Church and for absolute monarchs, and those two things are related because absolute monarchy's power came from a Catholic idea, the divine right of kings. This increased line of curiosity and skepticism and doubt and questioning is all part of a time period called the Renaissance that we're going to learn about. And it all really picked up speed with the invention of the printing press, which made it possible to copy books without having to write everything by hand. When you can spread information faster like that using a machine, not only can people build off of each other's ideas, so progress happens faster, they can do that across time and across space, meaning like different generations can pick up and build on what has been thought before. But it's also a lot harder for authority figures to control the ideas that are being spread and discussed. So all of that in the long run will lead to the eventual downfall of absolutism. I mean, you can get the impression like absolute monarchs seemed really strong. What could possibly go wrong? Well, over time, the Protestant Reformation erodes some of this faith in the church. It used to be thought the Catholic Church was the only path to salvation. And during the Protestant Reformation, the idea was proposed that actually people could probably read the Bible themselves and by faith alone be saved. The kind of thing that can only happen if you have a printing press producing lots of Bibles for people. You also get the scientific revolution, when people figure out a system for testing theories that's reliable, that always leads you to, a valid conclusion. And this leads to like some doubt about what the church had been teaching as scientific knowledge that was like patently wrong, including the idea that everything revolved around the earth. Finally, it led to the Enlightenment and social contract theory, which is the idea that the government gets its legitimacy not from divine right, but from its ability to protect the natural rights of the people it rules over, and that a government that can't do that is not legitimate. All of these things, in turn, will lead to the American Revolution against the English constitutional monarchy, the French Revolution against the absolute monarchs of France, and then also the Haitian Revolution, arguably the most successful slave revolt in all of history, and Latin American independence movements throughout South America, seeking independence from the monarchies that ruled them from overseas. So that is coming up next.